Hello and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. I'm back with Vincent to do another episode laying out our understanding of the current world situation and what to do to defend the working class in this period of turmoil. Hello, comrade.
Hello.
So today's episode is going to discuss the notion of gradualism and how it flies in the face of a scientific understanding of history. For those of you who listened to the previous episode, we're picking up on some of the themes we touched on there. For example, why China isn't imperialist, why the world since basically 1945 has been an American empire, etc. And we want to build on this by starting with how Marxists actually understand the world and how it works. How does change happen in the world? So on that note, I want to start by asking you, Vincent, to explain what you write in this article that's the basis of our whole discussion. It doesn't matter if you don't have it with you, but I'll just read out the quote. So you say, politically, Western liberals, social democrats, trade union bureaucrats, advocates of the BRICS Plus alliance, Chinese Stalinists, and many so-called revolutionaries all share something in common. That is, variations of a gradualist and pacifist conception of history and world relations. I guess just start by telling us, because that's a bit of a provocative statement. You're lumping together a whole lot of people or a whole lot of, trends in that. So help our listeners to understand what is this that they share in common and actually make a case for that.
Yeah. So we're sort of on our quest to try to understand what's going on in the world. And I think this is a very important question, although it might be a little more theoretical, quote unquote. It's actually an important question because it's about how do you understand the world. And it's sort of, all these trends that you named are obviously very different for 1,000 reasons, but they all come together politically under gradualism. So what do I mean by that? Really concretely, we explain a bit in the article, but it's like liberals in the West for decades, their political conception was that gradually with social reforms, the world is going to improve, democracy will improve, rights for minority will improve, and you have this conception of step by step, we're making a better world. And it's the same for social democracy. It's like gradual reform of the capitalist system will lead gradually to better condition for the working class.
I was going to say with Western liberals, I mean, the quintessential quote is Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, right? That after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've now basically tried and tested everything. We've finally arrived at the best system possible, liberal democracy, and it's going to be onwards and upwards from here.
Exactly.
That was like taught in all the universities in the West, basically like poli-sci 101, etc. But anyways, that's quintessential Western liberalism, a very crude understanding of how the world works. But anyways, so you were explaining Western liberals.
Yeah, or like Martin Luther King, like the art of justice is long, but it always points towards justice or something like that. Yeah, and so you see the same thing among social democrats and like reformists or trade union leaders. The gradual development of workers' organization leads to a better world, better conditions. And then also the
Second
BRICS.
International.
Yeah, the Second International, but you see it still today. It's like gradually, workers make some gains and sort of grab stuff from the capitalist. And, this is the path towards a more just world. And this also includes the advocates of the BRICS alliance. So, the BRICS, so the alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. There are many people, multipolarity people. They believe that the gradual development of China, of Russia, of these countries, the strengthening of trade and this alliance will slowly and gradually undermine the domination of the US on the world system and lead to like a world system which is dominated not by a single power, but like multiple power. And this will sort of gradually and peacefully lead to a more just world system, where there's various counterweights. So it's again, this idea that gradually and peacefully, without like huge shock, you can lead to a better world. Like the Chinese Communist Party, their doctrine is pretty open about this. It's like globalization is an inevitable trend. It's just something objective. It cannot be stopped. It's just happening. And all China has to do to secure its position is just continue to grow, continue to on this path, and objectively and gradually the China will rise and the world will be more just. And so everywhere we see the same trend. The great trends of history are really reduced to like everything is an incremental accumulation of developments leading to like constant progress. And this plagues the left really in all its different trends, you get to the same gradualist conception.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll get to the far left in a few minutes. So, all right. Obviously, there's a problem with this gradualist conception. So, lay out what is a scientific or a Marxist understanding. Like, what's wrong with the gradualist approach?
Just on a point on a historical level, gradualism and gradualist conceptions have always been the hallmark of reformism in the workers' movement for like over a century. You had Bernstein in the Second International was a form of gradualism. The reformism in general was always a form of gradualism. Trotsky wrote an excellent book called Where is Britain Going?, which I encourage every British socialist or every socialist to read. And a chunk of it is a polemic about gradualism because that was the theory of the Labour Party. So gradualism is not a new problem or a new ideology in the left and the workers' movement. But more generally, why it's wrong, it's because it's just simply not how the world works. And again, Trotsky explains this very well against the Labour Party. It's like throughout history, there is gradual development, obviously, but the gradual developments always lead to sudden and violent shocks, you know? So if you think of the development of capitalism developed as a system inside feudalism, like during the Middle Ages. And it developed gradually, you know, the merchants became capitalists, accumulated capital. But capitalism didn't then develop only gradually. It really burst out of that old system, you know, ripped it apart with revolutions and war, you know, the French Revolution, the Civil War in England, etc. And this shows how gradual development leads to sudden and violent shock. Like new systems are created gradually, but they impose themselves only through violent, brutal shocks. And if you think about it a little bit in life, many things are like that. So like when there's economic crises are obviously violent, sudden shock. They are prepared by gradual development, you know, the speculation of banks, bad loans, etc., slowly, and then boom, there's a big shock. Strikes, the exploitation of the working class, slowly prepare the strikes. And that's how dialectics in the world sort of function. You know, the gradual, peaceful, quote unquote, accumulation of phenomenon leads to, at a certain point, the change of quantity into quality, which doesn't happen peacefully, but really as a boom. And that's so, okay, why is that important to understand the world? I guess we'll get into it in a minute, but it's important to really have this dialectical understanding of the world, or else you won't understand social change in general. How all the whole way society works and the whole way society changes is really through these crises, these brutal shock and the role of Marxists is essentially to render this process conscious to the working class, and how to impose its own will on society, it must gradually prepare itself to then destroy the old world, essentially.
I mean, you know, when you lay out that, okay, the Western liberals, trade union reformists, bureaucrats, etc., they share this gradual conception. I think that's not very controversial to most leftists. But what they will take issue with is, well, the far left has also imbibed in this, right? I think it's important for us to discuss, well, how did this happen? I'm talking very, very generally, because as materialists, we understand that our ideas, they're determined or, you know, in large part influenced by our material conditions, surroundings, etc. So what is it that kind of led to gradualism really infecting the Marxist movement in the way that you say it has?
Well, in general, it's always the same thing, but there's a particularity with the post-Soviet period. Like in general, so I mentioned in the late 19th century or the 20th century, gradualism existed. It's always usually the product of an upper layer inside the workers' movement, which gets benefit from imperialist plunder, which gets certain privileges, trade union bureaucrats, head of workers' parties that have gained a certain influence and a certain respectability. So it's that's the Leninist classic theory of like this labor aristocracy on top of the labor movement gets certain privilege and starts to develop theories that, oh, maybe you don't need revolutionary change in the society, that you can actually arrive at certain progress peacefully, gradually. This is traditionally, in general, the basis for gradualism. And it's not so different in the post-Soviet period, because what we argue is that the root of gradualism in our epoch is really rooted in the period of globalization, where after the fall of the Soviet Union, the US was the complete hegemonic power, and this enable a certain development of the economy, certain economic growth, globalization, free trade. There was massive expansion of world trade, and a certain relative development of productive forces temporarily. And this period really gave to capitalism, to the American system, a certain appearance of like freedom. Globalization during, I'm talking about the 90s to 2000, like it's as if economic relations appeared like organic, natural, trades and money were circulating all around the world. Billionaires from India, bought like mansions in the US. Russian oligarchs bought football teams in Britain. And you had sort of this appearance of an economic system which was working not so much under the coercion of like an imperial power, but sort of naturally. Obviously, all of this was an appearance because what was behind that was obviously the hegemony of American imperialism. However, this sort of period of prosperity really gave birth to a lot of Marxists who also were trying to come up with theories about why maybe you don't need like revolutionary change anymore. Maybe gradual solutions exist. And in particular, a lot of leftists in that period, which is a bit different than before, found jobs in academia. And you had this armies of people in the socialist movement who were professors, who were academics, and who, with a lot of generous subsidies by the state, were developing all sorts of theory about imperialism and how imperialism was sort of about vague notion of export of capital, how, since most countries export capital, imperialism is sort of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And you have, I think, all these gradualist theory rooted in that prosperity in academia, which sort of corruption on the left, really. Now, I'm not saying everything that comes out of academia is bad or whatever. There are useful stuff, but in general, that's true that a lot of leftists have gotten jobs in academia and had produced theories which really seek to disappear the need for a revolutionary change, the need for a brutal confrontation with the old system to get a new one, and that you could achieve it gradually.
I mean, even more than academia, what I'm thinking about is the EU. Because when the Soviet Union was around, it was just uncontroversial that the EU is this, or the EEC at the time, this imperialist anti-Soviet bloc. But there was this massive just love fest for the European Union because, you got open borders. It's like, you're just going to gradually have just, I don't know, some kind of I don't even know if I can call it socialist, but, just this gradual disappearing and withering away. Yeah, withering away of the borders. And it's all great, And even, I mean, we're here in Britain and the huge, like all the liberals in Britain, right? They basically are super derisive and look down on anybody who voted Brexit. Granted, we don't agree with the reasons that a lot of people voted for Brexit, but, that, these people are backward. They don't like the social liberal EU. But I think the EU was also this huge thing, which the left basically just stopped calling this imperialist cartel, which it is.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think on Brexit, it shows many ways how the left has become more tied to the liberal middle class than the working class. Regarding the EU, you're absolutely right. So the EU, yes, was essentially set up as an anti-Soviet organization of various imperialist states, and it was sort of the economic wing of NATO. And there was really a change in the late 80s where, in order to get the workers' movement to support the EU, because it was quite common in the working class and the left to oppose it, there was sort of this new ideology that, the EU could become a social Europe, a sort of tool to promote workers' rights. And certain Marxists even using theories of like, the breakdown of borders and the unification of nations is being historically progressive, which is true in general. Therefore, the EU is sort of a step in this direction. And of course, elections to EU Parliament provided great subsidies for left group. And the EU being quite popular among the liberal intelligentsia, it was sort of not very trendy to be strongly opposed to the EU. And so I think it is part of that adaptation to liberalism and that adaptation to gradualism, as if this imperialist cartel could be sort of gradually reformed into like a socialist United States of Europe, right?
Yeah. So the world doesn't work according to the gradualist theory of history. Things don't just gradually change and, empires don't gradually rise up and then gradually decline. I guess the punchline of what we want to get to is the following. You mentioned in our last episode that the key task for revolutionaries today is to prepare and lead an independent working class struggle internationally against US imperialism, which is really hell-bent on crushing, the world and getting everybody into line in its drive against China. So, I guess to put it concretely, how is gradualism an obstacle to this fight?
Yeah, I think that's an important question because although most people who are in Marxist group will probably would agree with everything I've said so far, and will both, say, oh yeah, gradualism, reformism, that's wrong. You need revolution. We understand the dialectics, conflicts, etc. However, their visions of the world is often completely full of these gradualist illusion. And the most obvious example is on China. So as you said, we've demonstrated in the last episode how the crucial task to fight the American empire, that the American empire hasn't been broken up. It still exists. It's still the main thing, and that no one is really seeking to build a counterposed empire. But for many on the left, they view China as this new imperialist power, and they view the world as if it's a struggle between China and the US for world domination. Now, we've mentioned the programmatic implication of this. We can come back to it. But just in terms of the analysis, that is a gradualist analysis, because think about it. First of all, they believe that capitalism in China was gradually restored. Capitalism in the Soviet Union, in Russia, was restored. Everybody knew when, in 91, 92, it was a huge shock. The society collapsed. The Russian GDP decreased by like 40%. It was a tremendous social catastrophe. In China, you didn't have such a social catastrophe. Yet they argue that capitalism was sort of gradually restored. Nobody knows exactly when. It just happened for years and even sometimes decades. Nobody knows. Nobody can put like a precise date because there just hasn't been this shock, this sort of brutal replacement of a social system by another. So capitalism was gradually restored. So that's totally gradualist. You don't have the restoration, a counter-revolution. That's what it's called, a counter-revolution, without like a profound shock in society. Then somehow, all Marxists would agree that in the 90s, the US was the hegemon, dominated essentially almost the entire planet. And so they argue that now, peacefully and gradually, the world has been redivided. That you have China and the US fighting for the world. So like all of a sudden, China has its own empire and is trying to steal colonies from the US. Where did it come from? When was the war where this happened? Or where was at least the big rupture where this happened? Mm-hmm. And so you see that all this view that China is imperialist, China is capitalist, is actually totally mired into gradualism. Peacefully and gradually, you had a counter-revolution and then the birth of a new imperial power without wars, without shock, without big rupture in the world order.
Yeah, and I think, you touched on this already, but the left will swear up and down by Lenin's imperialism as if it's one of their Bibles. And, everybody quotes that thing about imperialism as the export of finance capital, blah, blah, blah. But a more fundamental feature of imperialism is a redivision of the world, right? So to get to your point, like, where are China's colonies? Where is who's China oppressing? And I'm sure different left groups can come up with their own answers about, it's doing this or that. But let's just be concrete. China is encircled by the US and China doesn't oppress any other countries, right? Like that, those are key features of imperialism as well.
Yeah. They'll say that it oppresses minorities inside China.
Yeah,
which is true,
deny.
but which is absolutely true. But like that's the case for like almost every country on the planet oppresses certain minorities inside its border.
Do we see Chinese air bases, all over the world?
Yeah, or they'll say that China has colonies in Africa or like certain countries in Asia. But like, here's the thing. So we come back to that academic, gradualist, peaceful view of imperialism. Imperialism is not just about investing in another country. A bunch of countries on the planet have investment in other countries.
I mean, Indian billionaires own British Steel. Like that's
exactly.
a joke.
No, but it's true.
Yeah.
Is India controlling Britain? Like, is British imperialism under the boot of Indian imperialism because Tata Steel is, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, exactly.
It's an absolutely good example. But there's this view on the left that, China has investment in Africa, therefore it dominates Africa. Now, I'm not saying that what China is doing in Africa is good or whatever. That's not even the question.
Yeah.
But what's removed from this is that, yes, imperialism comes from economic relations, but you don't have imperialism without force.
Exactly. Yeah. And the force is what's totally just minimized, disappeared because why? Because force flies in the face of like seeing gradual change happen without, force.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's this thing that gradualism also evacuates is the question of force. So China has investment in a bunch of African countries. It does. But which African countries does China control? Where in Africa does China impose its will on like the governments, either directly through colonies or indirectly through neo-colonies? Like look at the US, a bunch of countries the US calls a shot. If they do something the US doesn't like, there'll be economic blackmail, there'll be regime change, there'll be sanctions, there'll be a bunch of things that they'll do to basically crush that country. Where does China do this?
Right.
So it's not, that's why these theories of like, oh, export of capital are really disorienting and in the end end up really masking the real imperial power of the United States because they really remove the aspect of force. Or gunboat diplomacy, or that's what imperialism is. It's not accessory to imperialism. A lot of leftists quote often Lenin, how Lenin kept hammering that imperialism is not just a policy, it's not just like military, it's rooted in the economy. That's absolutely true. But what we've seen in a lot of leftists in these days is that they remove the militaristic aspect. They're just like, oh yeah, India invests capital in this country, therefore India is an imperialist country. And it's like, no, like India doesn't control the other countries.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think to start wrapping up this point, why is it that we felt a need to discuss gradualism in a more sort of theoretical way is because this has implications for how we try and fight back against the main power making everybody's life miserable today, the US. That this has implications. And we touched on this again in the last episode. As you write here, those who want to fight US imperialism must rid themselves on any gradualist illusions. Without doing this, it's impossible to understand the world, the direction it's going in, and crucially, what to do.
Yeah. Well, it's just that, whether it's Western liberals, the BRICS people, reformists, or even Marxist revolutionary, in the end, the implication of their theories is always to remove or deny that the main task is to defeat the US empire and that the US empire will not leave the scene of history like peacefully. It's a way to deny this, just like the BRICS, we'll have a multipolar world order. No, the US empire controls most of the world and will fight to keep that control. So you're not going to have like a peaceful order emerging gradually. There's going to need to be a struggle. Or same thing if you think that, well, now China has risen and has an empire and now the world, the whole world is about who will dominate the world, China and the US. Well, you're already erasing the fact that, no, the US controls the world and the US is trying to move in to crush China. So without knowing whatever your intention, you are ending up capitulating to US imperialism with such theories. And so it's really to make this point that the US empire is not going to go down without a fight, that there's not like a shortcut to building organization that can really organize the struggle, the fight against it, that it's not going to just, peacefully wither away. Gradually, you're going to have something better. Or also that competing imperialist power or competing order don't just sprung up without any peacefully like that. They need to carve themselves. So it's to orient Marxists really and to get rid of these pacifist illusion that the US empire might disappear peacefully.
I mean, at bottom, it's that any other conception really ends up concretely, what it does is it disorganizes, it undermines the building of an independent working class struggle against the main enemy on this planet. So that has some serious implications. So any leftists listening out there,
you've seen it recently, like in our previous episode, the war in Iran had not started, but so Israel bombed Iran, the US joined this bombing, and really their goal was to try to give a lesson to Iran, reaffirm who's the boss in the Middle East, and really try to crush like a semi-colonial country. Obviously, only Marxist position is really to have a side and defend Iran. There's a bunch of Marxists who were arguing like, oh, well, Iran is reactionary, or Iran receives like aid from China and Russia, which actually they receive very little, but whatever. They receive aid from China and Russia, and these are imperialist powers, so we don't have a side here.
So we're just going to let that country be bombed. Just how criminal when the main imperialist power in the most blatant, like horrible way. Trump was like, he said some really egregious stuff, as always he does, but like he wants complete submission of Iran or whatever. And for any revolutionaries to stand aside and not take a side, I mean, I can't get over how disgusting that is. But
yeah. But that's where these theories lead you. Like China is imperialist and they've sent like one plane to Iran. So therefore Iran is aligned to China. Therefore we don't have a side, defeatism if Iran gets bombed by the US. So yeah, like we're laughing, but it's where these theories lead you. Yeah. And you see how that's such a concrete example of like totally capitulating to U.S. imperialism. And don't be surprised if the Marxists have adopted these position that the toilers in the global South will think that these sorts of Marxists are fucking ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, the Middle East, West Asia, there's a reason why Marxism is absolutely, doesn't exist there, right? It's because,
it's small, in influence.
Marx has not been able to deal with many, many things with respect to that. But I think one of those things is really how to deal with the question of oppressed countries and imperialism. But anyways, that's for another day.
Another episode. But it's but the precondition for that and to get a Marxist to take root in these regions is one of it is to break with gradualism, that you can gradually reform imperialism, or that imperialism will sort of gradually leave the scene. No, as we just saw with Iran, they'll reaffirm who's boss, and it's going to be plenty brutal. It's not going to be a gradual and peaceful process, so better get ready.
All right. So on that note, let's end this one here. Our next one will, unless something emergency, something else, some country bombs another country, our next episode will take up how the U.S. system works, and we'll go a little bit into the nitty gritty. And, it'll still be in line with these themes that we've been taking up, but that's what we'll be doing next time.
Yeah.
So until then, we'll leave you here. Goodbye.
All right. Goodbye. Thank you.
All right. Bye.